well, let's get started. Again, I'm Candace Williams. I am Director of Major Gifts at NatureServe, and welcome to Plight of the Pollinators webinar. Just a few housekeeping notes. We'll be using the chat function like you're doing now throughout the webinar, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments. Our Chief Advancement Officer, Karen Fernandez, will be dropping links in the chat to any important sites that our presenter refers to. We'll also have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please use that Q&A feature within Zoom to submit your questions, and we'll do our best to address them. If we cannot get to them, I encourage you to email our presenter, Dr. Cornelisse. Her information is on the first and last slide. We are recording this webinar, and a link to the recording will be sent to you all tomorrow. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat. Now, I want to emphasize something crucial and exciting. Today, you'll be learning about new findings that are slated for publication very soon. Because of this, the information presented in this webinar is not for external distribution. This is an invite-only donor webinar, and the content shared here is exclusively for this audience. So if you'd like to share this information with others, we ask you to please contact us for approval before doing that. It's essential to protect the integrity of this soon-to-be-released publication. So let me take a moment and introduce NatureServe. For those of you who are less familiar with us, NatureServe's mission is to leverage the power of science, data, and technology to guide biodiversity conservation and stewardship. We are the authoritative source of data on threatened and endangered species and their habitats. We focus on science, data, and technology, not advocacy. And this focus makes our data widely trusted and used by government and industry alike. But what truly sets NatureServe apart is our wonderful network of programs comprised of more than 1,000 scientists across North America and Canada. Together, we collect, analyze, and distribute detailed scientific data about more than 100,000 species and ecosystems, pinpointing what exists, where it's found, and how it's doing. This map you see here represents the NatureServe network footprint today. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Cornelisse. Dr. Cornelisse is an invertebrate zoologist at NatureServe, bringing over 15 years of experience in entomology and conservation biology. She holds a BA in biology from Boston University, an MS from San Francisco State University, and a PhD from University of California, Santa Cruz. Go banana slugs, where her research focused on tiger beetle conservation. Before joining NatureServe, Tara worked in land conservation and served as a senior scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity, focusing on pollinators, and held a postdoctoral position at the American Museum of Natural History, excuse me. She also served as an assistant professor in animal behavior ecology and conservation at Cornelisse College, where she studied bumblebees and monarch butterflies. Tara's work has involved collaborations with a diverse range of partners, from local to federal biologists and land managers, academic and NGO scientists, and the public. Her work has resulted in numerous publications, presentations, and educational modules and reports on invertebrate conservation. She currently enjoys exploring Northern California from her home in Sonoma County. So please join me in welcoming Tara. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Candace. Thank you so much. And welcome to all of you. Thank you for making the time today to come to this webinar. I'm really excited to talk to you about some great analysis that we did on the plight of the pollinators. And as Candace mentioned, this work is going to be published imminently. So you are really getting a sneak peek. So pretty cool. So overall, our main question was we were really interested in what is the status of pollinators in the US and Canada. And as Candace mentioned, NatureServe is uniquely situated to answer this question because we have this amazing network of scientists throughout US and Canada. And as a result of the work we do, we were able to provide a really broad taxonomic assessment of pollinators. And so what that means is basically we were able to look at a large group of pollinators. So not just bees or not just butterflies, but all of them together. And I'll tell you about those groups in a moment. And as far as we know, ours is the largest and broadest taxonomic assessment of pollinators. So before we kind of jump into that, though, I wanted to give some context about why we were interested in this question in the first place. So some of you may have heard or read this article, but in the press, there's been a lot of information about insect decline. And this was sort of kicked off by the New York Times article about what they called the insect apocalypse. And unfortunately, we have, shown that insects are declining, but apocalypse has not been such a word that scientists have loved so much. But I'll show you some research that kind of shows that the situation is pretty dire, including our own. And this was kicked off with a study that came out of Germany. And what these scientists did were they looked at insect biomass. So they collected insects and they actually weighed the collections of insects, so the biomass of those insects. And they did it in the same place for over 30 years. And they were alarmed in that they found a greater than 75% decline in that insect biomass. And this was a result of something they weren't sure of because the actual land that they collected this in had not really changed much in those 30 years. So it kind of kicked off the alarm. And it turns out that a lot of people were sitting on a lot of data about insect declines, and there's been since several publications. Another one that kind of started showing that pollinators, in fact, are probably ones that are most taking the hit, came out a couple of years later. And this looked at a broad scope of different types of insects. And so what this graph is showing you are different types of insects along the bottom axis. And then the different colors represent how much of those groups are actually vulnerable. In the case of the orange color, endangered or extinct, or somewhat declining. So the orange and the yellow are kind of the worse off, as well as the gray. So you can see that, yes, there's a couple of groups of beetles. Carabids are actually, they include the tiger beetles, which, as Candace mentioned, are a group that I studied as a graduate student. And we know that those are not doing pretty well. Same with dung beetles. However, the other groups that kind of have more of that orange and yellow are the butterflies, moths, and the bees. So those are the pollinators. So we started seeing these trends in pollinators about 5 years ago. And we continued with the literature and saw that pollinators are indeed taking the hit. A study that looked at bee families. And so this is a couple families of bees. Apidae is the family that has bumblebees in it. And Megachilidae is a family that has leafcutter bees in it. And what they looked at over decades were the number of records of these bee families. And you can see in the last 30, 40 years, those number of records have really steeply declined. Similarly with butterflies, there's been studies that have shown they've declined. Here's one out of the Midwest that showed over the last 30-ish years, butterfly records have also went down. So we knew this here at NatureServe, and we were really interested. Can we use our data then to analyze the overall conservation status of pollinators in the US and Canada? In addition to this kind of broad question, we were also interested in what groups are most at risk. And being NatureServe, of course, we were interested in the geography of these species. So we were interested in where do these at-risk species occur? And then also what and where are the major stressors of these at-risk species? And in order to get started, we actually had to define what is a pollinator. And you might think to yourself, if someone asked me what is a pollinator, I could probably answer that. But in fact, it's actually a little bit more complicated than at first glance. And there's some debate among researchers as well. But we used a simple definition, and we defined a pollinator as an animal that visits a flower and consumes a floral resource. So something like nectar or pollen. And as a result of visiting that flower and consuming that resource, going from flower to flower, they move pollen and thus pollinate. So we were also able to include a broad taxonomic scope of pollinators because we were able to look at how many of these species NatureServe has assessed. And so we were able to include these groups because they had at least 80% of their pollinating members were well known enough to be ranked. So these are the groups we included. We included several bee groups, including bumblebees, carpenter bees, digger bees, as well as those leafcutter bees, some sweat bees. We also were able to include all known species of butterflies in the US and Canada. So that's pretty exciting. We also included pollinating macro moths, so some of those moths that are a little bit larger that we know that pollinate. We were also really excited to be able to include nearly all of a subfamily of flower flies. You may also know these as hoverflies. And then a couple genera of beetles. And I realized just this morning that we've neglected to include the vertebrates on this slide. And we actually did include a few bat species as well as several hummingbird species. So I will show you some vertebrate data as well. The reason we were able to do this is because all of these species have been assessed for their conservation status within the last 10 years, and they've been assessed using the NatureServe rank calculator. Some of you may be familiar with the NatureServe rank calculator, but it is a really unique tool that automates the ranking process and really promotes accuracy and transparency. It's known as a standardized scientific method that has empirical methodology. And if you are interested in learning more, if you don't know too much about the rank calculator, you can actually access an Excel version of it on our website. And then there's a couple of documents that go along with it that explain in great detail the methods behind it. But it's a really neat tool. And so in order to get the conservation status assessments of these species, we need to kind of know a lot of information. And in general, the way that a species is assessed for its conservation status is using a few categories in the rank calculator. The first one is a rarity category, and so that looks at the range of species as well as the number of current occurrences of those species. The next category is a trends category. So we're thinking like, are the populations of that species increasing? Are they decreasing? Are they staying the same? And that is both over the short term, so about 10 years for most insects, or 3 generations for things that have longer generation times, and then over the long term, kind of as far back as we have records, but up to a couple hundred years. And then another important category are the threats. And so we look at the threats to these species in terms of their scope. So how widespread are these threats, their severity, how much are these threats impacting the populations, and then whether they're current or not. So you can imagine it takes a bit of time to gather all this information on a single species. Luckily, we have our amazing NatureServe network where we're able to tap into a lot of data for these species, but we're also able to use some fantastic online databases that have occurrence records that come from studies or museum records as well. And of course, you're probably mostly familiar with iNaturalist, which is using community science data. We also rely pretty heavily on publications, so scientists who have published information about these species, and there's been some really great publications, as I showed you a couple of them in the last couple of decades, about bees and butterflies. So we put all this information into the rank calculator, and we get out a rank. And so you may be familiar with the NatureServe rank status or categories, but I'm just going to talk about the global ranks today, so the G ranks. You'll also might see S ranks, which are subnational ranks, and those are ranks at the state or the territory or province level. So there's a scale here of the conservation status ranks, and we considered some to be at risk of extinction and some to be secure. So the G5, which is the secure, and the G4, which are apparently secure, we consider to be secure species for our analysis. And those are species that have pretty large ranges, they have a lot of occurrences, maybe not so many threats. The G4, they might be starting to get some threats or some decline. but we consider them to be more secure and less at risk of extinction. Whereas the other categories, the G1, the critically imperiled, G2 imperiled, and G3 vulnerable, we consider to be at risk of extinction. And these are species that either have really narrow ranges, not many occurrences known, some kind of decline in the past or currently, as well as some severe threats. We also included a category called GH, which is possibly extinct, with the H being historical. And these are species that we don't have records of them for many years, and maybe in some cases a few decades. And so it could be a result of people just haven't surveyed for them, but likely they are actually no longer where they used to be. We also have this other category, GU. I kind of stuck it down underneath here. And the GU is species that are unrankable or data deficient. And unfortunately, you can imagine for insects, there's a lot of these GU species where we just don't have enough information to actually rank them. And so they do fall out into that GU category. And as you'll see in the next slide, this is actually a pretty important category for us too in our analysis. So here are some results. So what did we find? So taking the conservation status of all of these pollinators, and we ended up including nearly 1,600 pollinators in our analysis. So like it was about 1,570 something species. So it was a lot of species we were able to include. And of those species, we found that 22.6% of them on average are at risk. And that was a range of about 20% to about 30%. And the reason that there's an average and a range is because of those GU species, those data deficient species. So the lower number assumes that none of those data deficient species are at risk. The higher number assumes that all of them are at risk. And then the average assumes that the same portion of those species are at risk as those that are ranked otherwise. So as you can imagine, because something doesn't have enough information about it, and so it's unrankable, it could in fact be because there just aren't that many records of it, and it could be because it is rare. So likely our average, could be a lower estimate, and so, but it's somewhere along those lines. Still a pretty alarming number to see that over 1/5 of these species are at risk of extinction. And then the donut graph here that you can see on the right is just showing you how all of those species fell out in terms of our ranking categories. So that historical, critically imperiled, imperiled, and vulnerable are the at-risk group. And then we did have this 43% secure, which seems like a big chunk, but it's still less than half. And then 27% apparently secure, which I find to be a really interesting category because these are species that have large ranges and a lot of occurrences, but there's something that is impacting them currently, whether it's a threat or a decline in their population. So those to me are kind of interesting and kind of where future conservation will be behooved to look at. Okay, so by group. So here are the results of the conservation and status assessments of pollinators by groups. And right away, you can see that we put the red and orange and yellow as those are those at-risk categories. And right away, you can see that the bees have the largest bar there of those colors. And so over 30% we found of the bees are in fact at risk of extinction. Whereas with the butterflies and moth, it was more closer to our average, around 20%, and the flower flies and beetles less so, less than 15% at risk. And you'll notice that the flower flies have a really big gray bar, and that is because a lot of those species, well, not a lot, but a chunk of those species are data deficient. Flower flies are a really unique group of pollinators, and they're getting more and more attention, but they haven't been studied as well as some of these other groups in the past. And we wanted to look at our data and our results in context of the other species that NatureServe has done this assessment for. And all of the pollinator groups are underlined in red here. And the average, the all assessed pollinators, is right smack in the middle of this lineup of at-risk groups. And the bees are the highest, as you can see. but the pollinators were not as at risk as some of these freshwater species. So the majority of species at the top of this table, unfortunately, have high at-risk species, and those are things like freshwater snails, freshwater mussels, shrimps, and then some aquatic insects as well, so caddisflies, mayflies, and stoneflies. But the pollinators still had a pretty high percentage, especially the bees. All right, so let's look at some maps. So these maps are showing you all the pollinator groups, and the blue one on the right is the species richness. So in other words, the number of species of pollinators across our study area. And the one on the left is looking at only the at-risk number of species across our area. And you can see that they line up fairly well, but the majority of pollinated species that we looked at and assessed were in fact in the West, in the Northwest as well. And the majority of the at-risk species were in the American Southwest. And there's a lot of reasons for this. I'll show you the maps for the bees and butterflies in a moment, and you'll see that they overlap pretty well. But the American Southwest is a really unique area of high biodiversity. You've probably heard that California is a floristically diverse area. Because there's a lot of topographic heterogeneity. So there's lots of, mountains and valleys, and there's lots of deserts. There's also this kind of bimodal precipitation that happens in the Southwest. And as someone who's in California, and I'm looking out my window right now, it's pouring rain. So we are in the rain area. But like in a couple months, it's going to be really dry. So this begets some really unique floral diversity, which then begets like a lot of really unique pollinator diversity as well. And I wanted to show you kind of the comparison of this to the map of biodiversity importance. So some of you may have seen this awesome map that NatureServe has produced. It's been in the news. And this is showing you the concentrations of imperiled biodiversity. And right away, the West and the Southwest is really highlighted in that red color, as you can see. So that lines up really well with our pollinator analysis. There's also much more imperiled biodiversity in the Southeast in this map, and that's because it contains a broader taxonomic group, not just pollinators. And if you recall, most of the top species at risk were unfortunately freshwater species, and their biodiversity is really in that Southwest area. So that's what that is driving that. So let's look a little more specifically at bees. So I'll talk a little bit more specifically about bees and butterflies, as those were our #1 groups and our top at-risk groups as well. Similarly to the other map, these maps are showing you the species richness of the bees as well as the species richness of the at-risk bees. Again, really concentrated down there in the Southwest and the West. And in addition to those factors I mentioned earlier, the bees in general are known to be have their highest diversity in desert areas. And that's a result of the fact that majority of them are actually ground nesting. And if you've ever spent some time out in this area, you know that we've got some really great kind of desert-like, grassland-like, scrubland areas where there's a lot of bare ground. So a lot of open areas between plants that provide that nesting habitat for bees. And then also just interesting kind of jumping into the bees, I wanted to see sort of what's going on with the different bee groups. Are all of them at risk, or is it a certain type of bee? And we found actually that the top declining bee, or the at-risk bees, are leafcutter bees, digger bees, and then bumblebees. And for those of you who follow the insect conservation literature or news, the fact that there's a lot of bumblebees that are at risk should probably not be a surprise, as those are really well studied and have been in the news. And some of them are actually protected under the Endangered Species Act now. But we were also a little surprised to find that the leafcutter bees and the digger bees were the most at risk. And particularly with the leafcutter bees, you'll notice that there's a big chunk of them that are in that red category, or critically imperiled or historical. And there's a handful of these leafcutter bees that we just have not seen in several years now. And so whether they are extinct or whether they are just not surveyed yet is kind of an interesting question, and in a way that we can focus our efforts in the future. Okay, great. So let's look at some butterflies. So the butterflies are a little bit different. They're still concentrated out in the West. But if you might notice that there's actually a high biodiversity and associated at-risk biodiversity of them in kind of the Rocky Mountain states as well. So not just the southwest, but also those mountainous areas. And unfortunately, as I'll show you in a moment, this means that butterflies are more at risk due to climate change. And butterflies have some unique adaptations in that they do really well with snow, and a lot of them overwinter as eggs or larvae under snowpack. And so they are kind of dependent on that. So that's why they can really do well in some mountainous regions. So let's look at those threats. So this graph is showing you the top threats to all at-risk species. And on the bottom are the different threats that we look at. These are the different threat categories that we have in our rank calculator, and then the number of species that are impacted by these threats, at-risk species that are impacted by these threats. And right away, you can see that climate change came out as our top threat here. It's one that's impacting the most at-risk species that we've included in our analysis. I wasn't quite surprised, but I was a little surprised at how much more it was than some of the other ones. Agriculture is also a big threat, and this includes conversion of habitat to agricultural lands, as well as some livestock grazing. We also found that modifications of fire, so more severe fire, issues with prescribed burns or lack of prescribed burns in a lot of cases, are a big threat to pollinators, as well as some hydrological changes. So things like dams and abstraction of water from areas. And then we also found that development, so urban housing development, invasive species, and pollution, which includes pesticides, were also big threats to these species. And so we're also interested in kind of looking at the geography of these threats. So where are these threats? And if you recall, like most of the biodiversity, the species richness was concentrated in the West, and as a result of that, and the most at-risk species were concentrated in the West as well, climate change comes out as a clear signal as the top threat in the Western states, as well as the Northern states and provinces and territories. Whereas in the center of both countries, agriculture, also probably not so surprising, came out as the top threat, as that's a big area of food growth. And then in the East, it was a little more varied. There was more threats from pollution, from urban housing development as well. So we thought this was kind of an interesting analysis. So keeping that in mind, with the butterflies in the West and the mountainous areas and climate change being a really big issue for them, I wanted to kind of show you a study that is looking at exactly that. So there's a lab out of the University of Nevada, Reno, Matt Forrester's lab, who's been really studying these long-term data sets of butterflies and looking at how they are responding to climate change and some other threats, which I'll get into in a minute. But this is a paper that came out a few years ago, and they showed that in the West, butterflies are decreasing by 1.6 annually for the past 4 decades, which might not sound like a lot, but if you, I didn't include a graph on this, but if you graph that over years, it is a pretty steep decline. And they were interested in looking at what kind of warming are impacting these butterflies. And so they looked at warming in the summer versus warming in the fall. And that's on the top of the graph, you can see to the left is when there's greater warming in the summer, and to the right is when there's greater warming in the fall. And then the rest are the rate of change in butterfly density. So that's what all the dots are there. And the line is the average. And if it's above that dotted line of 1, the butterflies are increasing. If it's below, they're decreasing. And you can see that when there's greater warming in the summer, they actually aren't impacted so negatively. But it's really the greater fall warming that's making there's a decline in these butterflies. And again, as someone who lives out here in the West, this isn't too surprising to me because we do have really hot summers, and sure, they are getting hotter, but the butterflies are pretty adapted to hot, dry summers here. Whereas with this greater fall warming, when we've got these really warm Octobers, for instance, that is really impacting the butterflies a bit more. And that could be because, they are adapted to either going into diapause around that time, which is sort of like a butterfly hibernation. And these warmer times are maybe causing them to be more active. And in fact, because of droughts, potentially, there could be less floral resources or flowers available for them. So that could be causing them to decline as well. And then on the right side, there's some really fantastic photos of Western butterflies. And it's kind of, I don't know, you probably can't see the species names there, but these are the species that are impacted by what they considered the warming trend to be the factor that's impacting these butterflies. And they've been declining over the years as a result. And we've got some really widespread butterflies on here. The monarch is on here, actually. Some painted ladies, the western ladies is on here. So some butterflies that we kind of associated with really big populations. And unfortunately, this is just projected to get worse, the climate change. So this is a figure of precipitation change projected pretty far into the future, but by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And the darker the brown are areas where it's predicted to get drier. And you can see in the Southwest, the story is not a good one. Particularly in the spring, it's predicted to get a lot drier than it is now. And that's a little bit scary, not only for butterflies, but the bees. That's kind of the center of bee hotspot. And bees are known to, in kind of Southern California, Arizona, that area, come out pretty early in the year, like March, April. And if it's really dry, they're just not going to have enough flowers to, get nectar and pollen from to then provision their young. So that's also another issue that we're worried about. And then this is kind of a busy figure, but I have found it to be the best figure to kind of show very quickly kind of what is happening. And really it's been called by a death by 1,000 cuts. So we've been kind of focusing on climate change here, but in fact, pollinators are experiencing many threats at the same time. It's not just climate change. In addition to that, they've got to deal with pesticide use, invasive species, development, and the like. So it is important to remember that there's a lot of synergistic things going on with these threats. And I just wanted to highlight a study that looked at just that. So this is the Melissa blue, and this species is a pretty common species throughout the US and Canada. And during our analysis and updating of conservation status assessments for this project, it went from a secure, so a G5, to apparently secure, to a G4, G5. And I didn't talk about rank ranges, but some of these species can actually have rank ranges as well. So G4, G5, the calculator will spit out. But what we talk about and what we use for all intents and purposes is the rounded rank, which in this case would be G4. So we round it to the more conservative rank. So it did go down a little bit, even though it is a pretty widespread species. And there was a study done exactly on this species, looking at kind of a synergy of different threats. And that this is kind of a complicated graph, but I'll just go through it quickly. So there's three things going on with this butterfly. It's dealing with climate change, it's getting warm. It's dealing with pesticides, which are on the bottom axis there, concentration going higher to the right. And then it's also dealing with this issue of this invasive agricultural plant, alfalfa, displacing its host plant, astragalus. And the survival, you can see this dotted dashed red line is where the survival of the butterfly is. So if it's below that line, the butterfly is not doing well. It's doing worse off, whether if it's above that line. And right away, you can see all the three dashed lines are below that line versus the solid lines. And that's the three dashed lines is where they're using that non-ideal host plant, that alfalfa. So if they're forced to use that because it's displacing their astragalus host plant, they're not doing as well. And then you can see generally all of them, especially the solid bars on top, are going from high to low, from left to right. And that's following the concentration of pesticides. And then finally, the little colors on those graphs, the yellow, orange, and brown, are showing different climate scenarios. So the current is the yellow, the orange is 3-degree warming, and the brown is the 6-degree warming. And right away, you can see both the lines, both the solid and the dashed line that have brown figures in it are lower than the other two. So this butterfly is, dealing with not only climate change, but also a change in its host plant as well as pesticides. So this is just a really kind of cool way of showing, an unfortunate way of showing the synergy of threats. Okay, so those are the results and kind of the conclusion for that. But I wanted to talk about kind of what this means, the bigger picture. I was really excited to be part of this analysis because before I started at NatureServe, I was involved in an analysis of what we can do for this insect decline. We created this insect conservation roadmap, and the idea was to create solutions for it and prioritizations. And one of the top priorities was to actually perform large-scale assessments of conservation status of insect groups to define these priority species. And that's exactly what we did here. We did this large-scale assessment of conservation status of these groups. And we're also, and I'll show you in a moment, helping to focus on certain conservation of species and education with our publication and things like this webinar. So our results also show where to concentrate efforts. So both in terms of conservation of species as well as surveys. And we really need that because this is a graph showing you what we know and what we really don't know about bees. And so more than half of the bees are not in public databases. And as I talked to you about the methods that we use for conservation status assessments, having things in public databases are so important to knowing how things are doing. And so the map on the left is showing where we know we've got such high bee biodiversity. So those are the number of species of bees that we know are there. And the one on the right is the number of species of bees that we have records for in the last like 15 years. So it doesn't add up, right? There's a lot of bees that we just don't know what's going on with. So work like this is really important to guide those efforts and figure out where to focus them. This work is also really important for species inclusion in state wildlife action plans and general status assessments. Some network folks, including some NatureServe folks, worked on a project where they showed basically how assessments feed directly into what species states prioritize for conservation. And then that really also goes right into funding. So if a state is going to prioritize a species for conservation and include it in its state wildlife action plan, it's much more likely to get funding. And then that funding goes into conservation efforts. So we're excited to have these data and these results feed into those as well. And then also, I want to highlight it's really important too to show where hotspots and trends are. And we have these neat maps that we showed across the United States and Canada. But also it's being used, this information, our status assessments are being used by places like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who have this neat North American bee distribution tool. And folks can look at where bees are in their area for their project or policies. And in addition to looking at what bees there are, they also get the status ranks provided by NatureServe. So doing work like this project, updating these status ranks, the folks can now access these accurate ranks. So that's a pretty cool connection as well. And then finally, there's so much more to tell with these data. Stay tuned for the publication. As I mentioned, we just got word that it's happening, so we're very excited. So it should be out soon. But also, if you really want to read some more about these things, we've got great recent publications from NatureServe, a few in-house reports, as well as some recent peer-reviewed journal articles, that some of which I talked about today or cited today, that you can also look up. And I'm happy to share those with anybody who asks. All right, and that's it. So I would just like to thank all of my collaborators, our former chief scientist, Bruce Young, our amazing map creator, Hannah Siegel, my wonderful colleagues, Margaret Orms and Nicole Sears here at NatureServe, our a former invertebrate person at NatureServe, Dale Schweitzer, NatureServe Canada scientist John Klimko, and a few other folks that helped with ranks over the years and with this analysis. And of course, I would love to thank all of our funders who made this work possible, without which we couldn't have done this. Some of you, I think, are on this call, so thank you for joining, including the Park Foundation, the Manton Foundation, the Frankenberg Foundation, the DeCoys Charitable Trust, and then we also received some funds to complete this work from the U.S. Forest Service, NatureServe Canada, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. So thank you so much. And with that, I will turn it back over to Candace.
Okay, thank you, Tara. That was absolutely fascinating. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. So before we move on to questions, I really want to take an opportunity to acknowledge the donors on this call. We really appreciate the support you've already provided to NatureServe and emphasize that your generosity is absolutely critical to everything we accomplish, and we cannot thank you enough. For those of you who are inspired and would like to support our work, you can easily make a donation by scanning the QR code or visiting the donate page linked in the chat. I would also like to mention that whether you're able to donate or not, we encourage you to stay connected with us. Follow us on all of our social media channels and subscribe to our newsletter for the latest news and research updates. Okay, we received some really great questions. I'm going to start with something pretty broad, Tara.
Okay.
What can we do to help pollinators?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I anticipated this, and I actually created a slide for it. I was going to include it, but I didn't want to take too much time. So there's a lot you can do. Clearly, climate change is a very big threat to our pollinators, and it's difficult, for the individual to make big strides in that. But of course, there are things you can do to lower your carbon footprint. But the biggest thing for that is just to support environmental policies. And I have that on here too, as well as that includes the Endangered Species Act, which protects upwards of 60 insects right now, and there's in counting, hopefully some more. But other things you can do that actually mitigate a lot of these impacts of climate change is to plant flowers. I mean, we're talking about insects and species, bats. We didn't talk too much about bats and hummingbirds, but these are species that depend on flowers. And so you can really plant flowers, or another way to say that is to rewild areas that you can, whether it's your yard or even if you just have a balcony, you can put out flowers on that. And they will come. Also too, there's a lot of talk about getting rid of native plants, and that is important, but you have to be sure too that if you are getting rid of, non-native plants, if you are getting rid of invasive plants, that you replace them with natives, because some of these invasive plants are providing some floral resources. So if it is, if it's a grass, then sure, it's not going to provide a resource or nectar resource for a pollinator, but some invasive flowers, as long as they're replaced with natives, which is an important thing to do. Don't use pesticides. If you can avoid using pesticides in and around your home, that is an extremely important thing to do. It does make a difference every little bit, especially if you are planting flowers in those areas. Also, something that a lot of people don't think about is really important is to leave the leaves, and other downed or dead vegetation. As I mentioned, a lot of these bees are ground nesting or they're cavity nesting. A lot of the moths, this is a picture of a moth cocoon here on top of a leaf that looks just like a leaf, right? And if you were picking up leaves, you wouldn't even know you were picking it up. So it's really important to leave that there. For the insects to thrive and to have that period of overwintering. And some folks are worried about what their neighbors will think if they do that. And there are these cool placards you can get. Xerces Society has them, and the Society of National Wildlife Foundation does it. You can get these placards that say, "Hey, this is wildlife habitat." So it's not just my yard looking messy, but I got wildlife habitat. And just to finish up, turn off the lights at night. Moths in particular, there's a lot of nocturnal insects that are impacted by lights at night, even bees in some cases. Educate others on the issues, and if you can, do community science. iNaturalist is an extremely important platform now for us to get conservation data, occurrence data for some of these species that we can identify from photographs. So keep uploading your pictures. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara. All right.
Yeah.
I have next question from an audience member. How were the threats to at-risk species analyzed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's see, how are the threats to the at-risk species analyzed? So what we did was we have I don't want to get too in the weeds on this, but like we have different categories of threats and kind of higher level, lower level, and tertiary level. And so we kind of bulked them up into the higher level categories, and you saw all those categories on the bars of the threats, which is like climate change, agriculture. And so what we looked at really was just the number of the species impacted that were at risk, that were impacted by each of those threats, and just analyzed it that way. You may be wondering potentially like how we actually get the threats of the species. I'm wondering if that's part of the question too. And that's a really great question because it can be very tricky to figure out what threats are impacting what species. If there's a paper about the species or the Fish and Wildlife Service has done an analysis, it's much easier because it's right there for you to see. But sometimes you have to use expert knowledge, so folks who have worked with the species, and we can include those threats. As well as sometimes for like bumblebees, for instance, we know there are enough papers out about enough species that we know how they're impacted by climate change. So even if maybe that one specific species has not been necessarily studied about how temperature increases or droughts are affecting them, we can extrapolate that information because we know that the species of the same genus and kind of the same range are impacted by that. So yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question. Did you look at threats by pollinator group?
Yes, we did actually. And I was going to include these too. These are great. I have a good thing I kept all these like slides at the end. I was going to show you all that for sake of time. I left it out, but we did look at threats by pollinator group, and here is I have only the slides I can show you are butterflies and bees, but here's one for interest for butterflies, and you can imagine because of a big majority of the species that were at risk were bees and butterflies, that this pretty corresponds to most of the groups. But just sort of as our bar graph showed earlier, they are impacted. Yes, but climate change might be the largest slice. And in this case, it doesn't quite look like that, but, they are impacted by these threats in an almost equal measure. The fire modifications, development, climate change, and agriculture. And so you can see that they are impacted by them pretty equally, which going back to that idea of synergistic threats really hits that home. And then the bees kind of similarly. Agriculture is a bit bigger slice for the bees here, and then climate change is near equal. Actually, they're pretty close. So yeah, so you can see those are the big ones for bees. And then pollution is a little bit bigger for bees than butterflies. And I would assume that that's due to what we know more about pesticide impact to bees than butterflies. Yeah.
Another question from the audience here. Can you say more about the single Northeast area where there is a threat of disease indicated on the threats map?
Yeah, so actually I didn't fix this on the what do you call it, the actual figure, but the category is diseases and invasives species too. And so for that one, I think for the Northeast, a lot of the moths have been really impacted by the invasion of spongy moth, and then also the pesticide use to eradicate those that have impacted the moths up in that area. So I believe that's probably what's driving that trend. And the other thing that to talk more about diseases is with bees. And so bumblebees, we know, are really impacted by diseases, some of which are transferred over from honeybees. So honeybees being used commercially and being a non-native species, they bring a lot of diseases with them. And so they've unfortunately, their evidence shows that they're able to transfer those diseases to native bees as well by using the same flowers. And so I would have to go in and analyze that and look at it. But I bet that those are the things that are driving that factor.
Okay, another question. Let's see. Are there particular habitats where at-risk pollinators are found?
Yeah. Oh, this is another one. We did analyze habitats, and we were really interested in kind of figuring out where these, like literally what habitats, not just where geographically these pollinators are found. And here's a bar chart of showing you where the major habitat types occupied by at-risk pollinators. So the number of at-risk species and the habitat types. And the vast majority of them were found in woodland areas, and grasslands and scrublands or chaparral areas were also really important. And deserts, of course, was I talked about the importance of deserts to bees earlier. And these like shrubland, chaparral, grassland areas are so important for particularly butterflies, you know, and bees. There's just such a high floral diversity in these areas, but they're also really imperiled, especially grasslands. You know, there's, you know, estimates of upwards of 90% of our native grasslands are impacted by either development or invasive species or pesticides. So they're really important to keep intact.
All right, looks like we have time for another question here. Can you tell us more about the ranking process?
Yeah, sure. So I could go back. Oh, I might just give everybody whiplash if I do that. So I'll just stay here. But yeah, so the ranking process is an interesting process. So once you get a species you're about to rank, we have some great in-house tools that we use for mapping the occurrences. So I have to look at all of those databases that I just showed you, including the NatureServe network data, to see, okay, where is the species? Like how many occurrences can I find, and can I get it from, you know, something called GBIF or iNaturalist, or something called SCAN, which is just for arthropods, and put all of these data into a spreadsheet that I can then feed into our mapping program that can tell me, I can use to calculate the range of this species. And then I can also use that to calculate the number of occurrences of species, and then look and see how those occurrences have changed over time. And that gives me some information right away. I can put in those rarity factors, and then I can kind of see if there's if I can use that to estimate trends. But then from there, I'll do a deep dive into the literature where I actually really search for that species in reports and published peer-reviewed literature to see, okay, what do we know about it? What threats are impacting this species? And if it's a big group, like bumblebees, for instance, where, like I mentioned earlier, or Western butterflies, we have a lot of great data about their trends, but also what threats are impacting them. And so I can kind of see where is the species found, and then figure out what threats I could include. It also involves me looking at any subnational ranks. So if folks have ranked these species at the state level or the territory level or province level, those are really important, are really useful, I would say, for me to extrapolate what's going on to that species in that state. And I can use that information as well.
Okay, thank you. We have one last question before we end here. It is a multi-part question, and we're gonna try to address some of this. And David, we will get back to you for the rest of your question. What specifically can we do to make stormwater earthworks more palatable to pollinators in the Southeast?
Ooh,
And should we recommend native milkweeds extensively as monarch host plants? Or maybe even
Oh,
exclusive?
sorry. What was that?
Was it, should we recommend native milkweeds
Oh, yeah.
I think he meant to say exclusively as monarch host plants.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the science, I can answer that one last. I would say yes. The science on that has been changing as we're figuring out how the non-native milkweeds are impacting butterflies in terms of their like phenology and like terms of the timing when they lay their eggs, as well as diseases you've probably heard that they can bring it. So to be on the safe side, I think the standard is to still say yes, we should include or should just exclusively use native milkweeds. It does depend on the area and he said the southeast. Yeah, right. So I would have to look and see that. I know out here in the West, we only recommend exclusively native milkweeds because it can have issues with the timing of migration for butterflies as well as diseases. So I would say that would be yes. And then for stormwater catchments, I'm not sure what they look like, particularly in the Southeast, but in the Northeast where I have lived and worked, I know that they can be great areas for pollinators, planting native plants, particularly floral resources, flowers, plants that flower, basically what that means, particularly plants that flower throughout the season. So not just in the spring or just in the fall, but if you plant plants that are native that flower kind of staggered throughout the season, you're able to like kind of capture the needs of many pollinators in your area. We're able to do that. And then things like long-lived things like monarch butterflies, as you mentioned, will need both the spring and the fall floral resources.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tara. That's all the questions we have time for today, but if we did not get to your question, we will follow up with you. Tara, thank you for the whole presentation. It was wonderful. And on behalf of everyone at NatureServe, thank you for your support. Thank you for joining us. Just a final reminder that this information shared is not for external distribution. We will be sending a recording of this webinar to all attendees soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Candace.